In March of 2002, 27-year-old Anna Archer set out on a solo hike in the remote Sierra Nevada foothills of Northern California. She left her car at the trailhead with keys in the ignition, logged her route at the ranger station, and planned to return in 3 days. On the 6th day, when Anna did not check in, a large-scale search operation was launched. Search teams combed the wilderness for weeks, finding no trace, no footprints, no torn clothing, no signs of struggle. 6 months later, in September of 2002, park rangers responding to reports of smoke from an old logging road discovered an abandoned hunting cabin. The door hung on broken hinges. Inside, chained to an iron bed frame with heavy chains, lay Anna, barely conscious, severely malnourished and dehydrated, her blonde hair matted with dirt and grease. When they freed her, she whispered only one thing: "Douglas, he's coming back." At the time, everyone thought the picture was clear. The woman was describing a reclusive drifter who had taken her at gunpoint near the trailhead and held her captive. The manhunt continued for 3 more months. Nobody matching the description was found. Anna's version was accepted without question. 4 years have passed. In the spring of 2006, Cindy Marshall, Anna's former co-worker, contacted police with information that had been haunting her conscience. She revealed that weeks before her disappearance, Anna had been in regular contact with someone named Douglas, not a stranger but her estranged older brother, Douglas Archer, whom she hadn't seen in over a decade. Investigators pulled archived employment records. Buried in old email logs were messages between Anna and Douglas Archer discussing the plan and making it look real. But the key was something else. Cell phone records from 2002, previously overlooked during the initial investigation, placed Douglas's phone near the trailhead on the exact day of Anna's disappearance. Further digging revealed that Douglas had been released from a psychiatric facility just 3 months before Anna vanished. Property records showed he had purchased the very cabin where Anna was found, 4 months before her disappearance. This meant one thing: Anna's story could not be true. And it was not a detail that was wrong, but the foundation on which the entire rescue had been built for 4 years. The victim and the villain were not strangers at all. They were family. For 4 years, the case of Anna Archer sat in a filing cabinet in the basement of the Placer County Sheriff's Department, officially classified as unsolved but unofficially considered closed. The mysterious Douglas had never been found, despite composite sketches distributed across 3 states and dozens of reported sightings that all led nowhere. Anna herself had tried to move on, relocating to Sacramento, changing her phone number twice, and refusing all media interviews after the first anniversary of her rescue. The case had become one of those frustrating mysteries that investigators learned to live with. A crime with a known victim and a known perpetrator who simply vanished into thin air. Detective Riley Chen had been a junior investigator when Anna was found, tasked mostly with filing reports and coordinating search volunteers. By 2006, she'd moved up to handling cold cases, and Anna's file was one of several dozen she'd inherited. She pulled it out occasionally, read through the witness statements and search reports, studied the grainy photos of the cabin interior with its rusted chains and filthy mattress, and always came to the same dead end. Without a last name, without a verifiable physical description beyond older man, camouflage clothing, graying beard, there was simply nothing to pursue. The case wasn't cold because investigators had given up. It was cold because there was nowhere left to go. Then, on a Tuesday morning in April 2006, the phone on Chen's desk rang. The woman on the other end of the line spoke slowly, her voice tight with the particular kind of tension that comes from rehearsing a difficult conversation. She identified herself as Cindy Marshall, age 31, currently working as an administrative assistant in San Jose but formerly employed at the same Sacramento marketing firm where Anna Archer had worked before her disappearance. Chen grabbed a pen, suddenly alert. Witnesses from Anna's old life rarely came forward anymore, and when they did, it was usually to report another false sighting or share some useless piece of secondhand gossip. But Cindy Marshall wasn't calling about a sighting. She was calling about emails. Cindy explained that she and Anna had been work friends, the kind of colleagues who ate lunch together and complained about management but didn't socialize much outside the office. In the weeks before Anna's hiking trip, Cindy had noticed a change in her. Anna seemed distracted, anxious, constantly checking her phone. She'd started taking personal calls in the parking lot, speaking in hushed tones that would cut off abruptly when anyone approached. Cindy had assumed it was relationship trouble, maybe a bad breakup or family drama, and hadn't pressed. Then Anna disappeared. Cindy had given a statement to police back in 2002, describing Anna as a reliable employee with no obvious enemies, no financial troubles, nothing that would explain a violent abduction. She'd mentioned the phone calls and the distraction, but at the time, it had seemed irrelevant. The working theory was a random attack by a transient, not something connected to Anna's personal life. But something had been bothering Cindy ever since. About 2 weeks before Anna vanished, Cindy had walked past her cubicle and noticed an email open on her computer screen. Anna had stepped away to the restroom, and Cindy hadn't meant to snoop. She'd only glanced over because she thought Anna might have left a document Cindy needed. Instead, she'd seen a message that made no sense at the time but had lodged itself in her memory like a splinter. The email had been from someone named Douglas. The subject line read, "About the logistics." The visible portion of the message said something about meeting times and making sure everything looks right. Cindy remembered thinking it was odd phrasing, formal and vague in a way that didn't match how people usually wrote personal emails. But Anna had returned before Cindy could read more, and she'd quickly moved away, embarrassed at almost being caught looking. After Anna was found in that cabin, after she'd described her captor as Douglas, Cindy had felt a chill of recognition. But she'd convinced herself it was a coincidence. Douglas was a common name. The email could have been about anything: a work project, a friend's event, harmless logistics for a camping trip. And Anna had been through such hell, nearly died in that cabin. Cindy couldn't imagine bringing up some vague email memory that might upset her or worse, make her seem like she was doubting Anna's story. So she'd said nothing. For 4 years she'd said nothing. But the guilt had grown heavier. Cindy had moved to a new job, gotten married, started thinking about having children, and the secret felt like it was poisoning something inside her. What if that email had mattered? What if there was a connection she'd been too afraid to mention? She'd finally decided that she had to tell someone, even if it turned out to be nothing, even if it made her look foolish or paranoid. She couldn't carry it anymore. Chen listened to all of this with growing intensity, her pen moving rapidly across her notepad. When Cindy finished, Chen asked the question that would crack the case open. "Did you say Anna's email was from someone named Douglas? The same name as her supposed captor?" "Yes," Cindy said quietly. "That's why I'm calling. I should have said something years ago." Chen pulled Anna's original statement from the file and scanned it quickly. Anna had never mentioned knowing anyone named Douglas. She described him as a complete stranger, someone she'd never seen before the attack. But if Anna had been receiving emails from a Douglas before her disappearance, that fundamentally changed the narrative. It meant the name wasn't random. It meant there was a prior connection. Chen thanked Cindy for calling and promised to look into it. The moment she hung up, she was already dialing the district attorney's office. They would need a warrant to access Anna's old work email account. The marketing firm had likely purged employee data after 4 years, but tech companies were required to maintain backup archives for legal purposes. There was a chance the email still existed somewhere on a server. It took 3 weeks to navigate the legal process and another week for the IT forensics team to recover the archived data. When Chen finally received the digital file, she opened it on her computer with her supervisor, Lieutenant William Brennan, standing behind her shoulder. The inbox contained hundreds of messages, most of them mundane work correspondence. But when Chen filtered by sender name and typed Douglas, 7 messages appeared. The earliest was dated February 12, 2002, 5 weeks before Anna's disappearance. The subject line read, "Good to hear from you after all these years." Chen clicked it open. The message was brief, almost cautious in tone. Douglas, no last name given in the display, thanked Anna for reaching out and said he'd been thinking about her too, despite everything that had happened between them. He mentioned that he was in a better place now, and would be interested in meeting up to talk. The subsequent emails grew progressively more detailed and conspiratorial in tone. By early March they were discussing specific plans. One message from Douglas, dated March 8, included a sentence that made Chen's blood run cold. "I've been working on the location. Remote enough that nobody will stumble across it, but accessible if we need to get supplies in and out." Another email, sent from Anna's account on March 15, 3 days before her disappearance, read, "I'm getting nervous but we've come too far to back out now. Just remember, 2 weeks maximum. We stick to the plan and then this is over." The final email, sent by Douglas on March 17, the day before Anna left for her hike, was chillingly simple. "See you tomorrow. Make it look real." Brennan leaned closer to the screen, his expression grim. Who the hell is Douglas? Chen was already opening a new search window, typing Anna's full name into the department's database along with known relatives. The system took a moment to load, then populated a family tree based on driver's license records, property deeds, and archived census data. There it was. Douglas Michael Archer. Born 1967. Anna's older brother. Listed address: Nevada as of 1999. No current California residence on file. No recent employment records. But when Chin cross-referenced his name with the state's Health and Human Services database, she found something that made the entire case suddenly, terrifyingly clear. Douglas Archer had been a patient at the Napa State Psychiatric Hospital from 1998 to December 2001. He'd been released on a conditional basis just 3 months before Anna disappeared, diagnosed with paranoid delusions and a documented history of violent ideation toward family members. Chin looked at Brennan. She knew him. This wasn't a random abduction. They were in contact before she disappeared. Then why did she claim he was a stranger? Brennan asked. Chin stared at the emails on her screen, at the careful language about logistics and plans and making things look real. A cold understanding settled over her. Because, she said slowly, she was lying. This whole thing was staged. The discovery of Douglas Archer's identity opened a door that had been locked for 4 years, but what lay behind it was darker than anyone had anticipated. Detective Riley Chen and her team began pulling every available record on Douglas Michael Archer, and what emerged was a portrait of a man whose life had been defined by resentment, instability, and a festering hatred toward the sister who, in his mind, had stolen everything from him. Douglas was born in 1967, 8 years before Anna, in the affluent Sacramento suburb of Granite Bay. The Archer family had money, significant money. Their father, Robert Archer, had built a successful commercial real estate business in the 1970s, acquiring shopping centers and office complexes across Northern California. Their mother, Margaret, came from old San Francisco wealth, the kind of family that owned property in Pacific Heights and had their names on museum donor walls. By all outward appearances, Douglas and Anna had grown up in privilege, attending private schools and spending summers at the family's vacation home in Lake Tahoe. But the family records told a different story. When Chen contacted the Archer family attorney, a man named Lawrence Kepler who had represented the family for over 30 years, he was initially reluctant to discuss details. Attorney-client privilege extended even to family matters, he explained. But when Chin informed him that Douglas was now a suspect in a criminal investigation involving his sister, Kepler's tone shifted. He invited Chin to his office in downtown Sacramento, where he laid out the family's troubled history with clinical precision. The problems had started in Douglas's adolescence. He'd been a difficult child, prone to violent outbursts, expelled from 2 private schools for fighting, and eventually diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder at age 14. His parents had tried therapy, medication, and even a brief stint at a wilderness therapy program in Utah, but nothing seemed to help. Douglas was convinced the world was against him, that his teachers were conspiring to fail him, that his classmates were mocking him behind his back. The paranoia was exhausting for everyone around him. Then Anna was born and everything got worse. Kepler explained that Douglas had never adjusted to having a younger sibling. He saw Anna as an intruder, a competitor for their parents' attention and resources. As Anna grew older and proved to be an easy, well-adjusted child, good grades, popular with peers, athletically talented, Douglas's resentment calcified into something deeper and more dangerous. He would destroy her belongings, spread rumors about her at school, once even pushed her down a flight of stairs when she was 9 years old. That incident had resulted in a broken wrist and a family meeting where Robert Archer had threatened to send Douglas to a residential treatment facility if he ever hurt his sister again. The real breaking point came in 1995, when Douglas was 28 and Anna was 20. Their father had updated his will, and Douglas had somehow obtained a copy. What he read there sent him into a rage that would permanently fracture the family. Robert Archer had decided to leave the bulk of his estate, estimated at $12 million, to Anna, with only a modest trust fund for Douglas. The will explicitly stated that this decision was made due to Douglas's continued inability to manage finances responsibly, and his demonstrated lack of judgment in personal and professional matters. Douglas confronted his father at the family home, and the argument escalated into violence. According to the police report Chen obtained from the Granite Bay Police Department, Douglas had attacked his father with a fireplace poker, striking him twice before their mother and Anna managed to pull him away. Robert Archer suffered a fractured collarbone and refused to press charges, but the family imposed its own sentence. Douglas was cut off completely. No more financial support, no contact with his parents, no place in the family business. He was effectively erased. For the next 3 years, Douglas drifted. He moved to Nevada, worked sporadically in construction and warehouse jobs, and developed a reputation among those who knew him as someone who couldn't hold down employment because he was always convinced his co-workers or supervisors were plotting against him. In 1998, after threatening a former employer with violence, he was involuntarily committed to the Napa State Psychiatric Hospital following a court-ordered mental health evaluation. Chen obtained Douglas's psychiatric records through a court order, and they painted a disturbing picture. Douglas had been diagnosed with paranoid personality disorder with delusional features. The clinical notes described a patient who was intelligent and articulate but trapped in a cognitive prison of his own making. He believed his family had conspired to steal his inheritance, that Anna had deliberately manipulated their parents against him, that his father's will was part of an elaborate scheme to destroy his life. The doctors noted that Douglas was particularly fixated on his sister, often describing her as the golden child who ruined everything. Treatment had been difficult. Douglas was resistant to medication, convinced that the hospital staff were working with his family to keep him sedated and compliant. He participated in therapy sessions but used them primarily to reinforce his grievances rather than challenge them. The breakthrough, such as it was, came in late 2001 when Douglas began to show what his doctors interpreted as progress. He spoke less about his family, engaged more constructively in group therapy, and expressed a desire to move forward with his life. His psychiatrist, Dr. Helen Cartwright, noted in her final evaluation that while Douglas still harbored resentment toward his family, he seemed to have accepted that rebuilding a relationship with them was unlikely and that he needed to focus on his own stability. Based on this apparent improvement, Douglas was released in December 2001 with a conditional discharge. He was required to attend outpatient therapy sessions, maintain his medication regimen, and check in regularly with a social worker. For the first 2 months he complied. Then in February 2002 he stopped showing up to appointments. His social worker made several attempts to contact him, but Douglas had disconnected his phone and moved from his registered address. By March he was officially non-compliant with his discharge conditions, but the system was overburdened and no one pursued it aggressively. Douglas Archer had slipped through the cracks. What Chen found most chilling was the timeline. Douglas disappeared from the mental health system's radar in early February 2002. The first email between Douglas and Anna was dated February 12, 2002. That couldn't be a coincidence. Anna had reached out to her estranged, mentally unstable brother within days of him going off his medication and abandoning his treatment plan. Either she didn't know about his deteriorating mental state, or worse, she knew and contacted him anyway. Chen pulled Douglas's financial records next, using a federal warrant that allowed access to his bank accounts and credit card transactions. What she found confirmed her worst suspicions. In November 2001, 1 month before his release from the psychiatric hospital, Douglas had received a $35,000 cash deposit into his checking account, a lump sum payment from the liquidation of a small trust his grandmother had left him years earlier. He'd immediately begun making unusual purchases. A cash payment of $18,000 to a private seller for a remote property in the Sierra Nevada foothills, recorded in the Placer County property records. Purchases at hardware stores, chains, padlocks, a generator. Camping supplies, non-perishable food, water storage containers. And then, on March 18, 2002, the day Anna disappeared, Douglas made one final transaction. He withdrew $5,000 in cash from an ATM in Truckee, California, less than 30 miles from the trailhead where Anna had left her car. Lieutenant Brennan stood beside Chen as she laid out the documents across the conference room table, creating a timeline that told a story no one had wanted to believe 4 years earlier. A mentally unstable man with a documented history of violence toward his sister. A recent release from psychiatric care. A property purchase in the exact area where the victim was later found. Financial transactions that suggested careful planning and preparation. She knew exactly who he was, Brennan said quietly, staring at the timeline. She reached out to him, brought him into whatever plan they were cooking up, and then acted like he was a complete stranger when we found her. Chin nodded, but something was bothering her. She picked up the psychiatric evaluation from Dr. Cartwright and read through it again. One phrase stood out: patient continues to express belief that his sister owes him compensation for his exclusion from family wealth. What if Anna promised him something? Chin said slowly. What if she convinced him that if they staged this kidnapping, they could extort money from their parents and split it? Douglas gets the inheritance he thinks he deserves, Anna gets whatever she needed the money for. Then why did he keep her in that cabin for 6 months? Brennan asked. According to the ransom timeline we pulled from the original case file, the parents paid $200,000 within 3 weeks of her disappearance. If this was just a con, Douglas should have let her go after he got the money. Chen looked at the psychiatric notes again, at the descriptions of Douglas's paranoid delusions and his fixation on his sister. A cold understanding settled over her. Because he couldn't trust her, she said. His paranoia wouldn't let him. Anna probably thought she could control him, that it would be a quick scam and then they'd go their separate ways. But Douglas's mental illness made him unpredictable. Once he had her in that cabin, once he had the money, his delusions took over. He convinced himself that if he released her, she'd betray him. So he kept her prisoner, maybe planning to keep her there forever. The implications were staggering. Anna Archer had orchestrated her own kidnapping, using her mentally unstable brother as an accomplice, not understanding, or not caring, that she was putting herself in the hands of someone who had once tried to kill their father and who had spent years fantasizing about revenge against her. Chin closed the file and looked at Brennan. We need to bring him in. Now. The problem with Douglas Archer in 2002 was that he'd been questioned and cleared almost immediately. Detective Riley Chen found the original interview report buried in the case file, a single page of notes dated September 24, 2002, just 6 days after Anna had been found in the cabin. A Nevada detective named Mac Holloway had contacted Douglas by phone at the request of California investigators who were running down anyone named Douglas with a connection to the victim. The interview had been perfunctory, almost dismissive. Douglas had explained that yes, he was Anna Archer's brother, but they'd been estranged for years and hadn't spoken since the mid-1990s. He expressed shock at what had happened to his sister and said he'd been working construction in Reno during the entire period of her disappearance. He provided the name of his employer, a company called Sierra Ridge Builders, and said his foreman could verify his whereabouts. Detective Holloway had thanked him for his time and noted in his report that Douglas Archer seemed genuinely surprised by the news and had a solid alibi. The lead had gone nowhere, filed away as another dead end in a case full of them. But that was before Chin knew about the emails. That was before she understood that Anna's story about a stranger named Douglas had been a carefully constructed lie. Now, with the benefit of hindsight and the evidence of premeditated contact between the siblings, that brief phone interview looked less like due diligence and more like a missed opportunity that had cost the investigation 4 years. Chin needed to prove that Douglas had lied about his whereabouts in 2002. The employment alibi was the obvious place to start. She contacted Sierra Ridge Builders, only to discover the company had gone bankrupt in 2004. The owner, a man named Kenneth Marsh, had since retired to Arizona. Chin tracked him down through property records and called him on a Thursday afternoon, explaining that she was investigating a case from 2002 and needed to verify whether Douglas Archer had been working for his company during that period. Marsh's response was immediate and definitive. Douglas Archer? Yeah, I remember him. Worked for me for about 6 months in 2001. He was a decent framer when he showed up, but he had attitude problems. Always thought people were talking about him, starting arguments with the other guys. I had to let him go in November of 2001 because he got into a fight with another worker over something stupid, claimed the guy was sabotaging his work. Chin felt a surge of adrenaline. So he wasn't working for you in 2002? March through September? No way, Marsh said firmly. I fired him in November of 2001 and that was the last time I saw him. If he told somebody he was working for me in 2002, he was lying. Chen thanked him and immediately pulled Douglas's original statement. There it was in Detective Holloway's notes, Subject claims employment with Sierra Ridge Builders, Reno, Nevada. States he was on site during March-September 2002 timeframe. No one had bothered to verify it because Douglas wasn't a serious suspect at the time. He was just another Douglas being ruled out, one of dozens of men with that first name who'd been briefly questioned and dismissed. The investigation had been focused on finding a stranger, not examining Anna's family. The employment lie was damning, but Chin needed more. She needed to place Douglas physically in California, near the location where Anna had disappeared and near the cabin where she'd been held. In 2002, cell phone technology was less sophisticated than it would become, but phones still communicated with cell towers, and those communications created records. If Douglas had his phone with him, and if those records still existed, they would provide an irrefutable timeline of his movements. Chin contacted the major cellular carriers that had operated in California and Nevada in 2002, requesting archived cell tower data for Douglas Archer's phone number. It was a long shot. Most companies didn't maintain such old records unless compelled to by law, and there had been no legal reason to preserve Douglas's data since he'd never been a suspect. But one company, Pacific Bell, informed her that they'd migrated their legacy data to a new system in 2004 and still had archived tower logs available through a federal records request. It took 3 weeks to navigate the bureaucracy and obtain the records. When the data file finally arrived, Chin handed it to the department's digital forensics specialist, a young analyst named Brian Torres who specialized in historical cell site analysis. Torres spent 2 days processing the raw data, converting it into a visual map that showed every cell tower Douglas's phone had connected to between February and September of 2002. When Torres called Chin into his office to review the results, his expression told her everything she needed to know before he said a word. "You were right," Torres said, pulling up the map on his screen. This guy was definitely not in Nevada during the time period in question. The map showed a cluster of cell tower connections in Reno through early March 2002, consistent with Douglas's claimed residence there. But on March 17, 2002, the day before Anna's disappearance, the pattern changed dramatically. Douglas's phone pinged off a tower near Truckee, California, a mountain town about 40 miles from the trailhead where Anna had left her car. The following day, March 18, the phone connected to a tower even closer, less than 5 miles from the trailhead itself. The timestamp showed the connection occurring at 9:47 a.m., exactly when Anna would have been arriving to start her hike. "That puts him at the scene," Chin said, leaning closer to the screen. "It gets better," Torres replied, advancing the timeline. "Or worse, depending on how you look at it." For the next 6 months, Douglas's phone showed a consistent pattern of connections to towers in the Sierra Nevada foothills, in a remote area roughly 12 miles northeast of where Anna's car had been found. The phone would go silent for days at a time, likely when Douglas turned it off to conserve battery or avoid detection. But when it did connect, it was always hitting the same cluster of 3 towers that covered the mountainous wilderness area where the cabin was located. Torres zoomed in on the map, overlaying it with property records and topographical data. The cell tower coverage area intersected almost perfectly with the location of the cabin where Anna had been found. "He was there," Torres said. For 6 months, his phone repeatedly connected from that location. Sometimes just for a few minutes, sometimes for hours. But the pattern is unmistakable. He was staying at or very near that cabin the entire time Anna was supposedly being held captive by an unknown assailant. Chin studied the data, her mind racing through the implications. This wasn't circumstantial anymore. This was proof that Douglas had been exactly where Anna said her captor had been, during exactly the time frame when she said she was being held prisoner. Combined with the emails discussing the plan and Douglas's lie about working in Nevada, the evidence was becoming overwhelming. But Torres wasn't finished. He pulled up another view, this one showing data from September 2002, the week Anna was found. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a gap in the timeline. Douglas's phone goes dark on September 14, 2002. No connections at all. Then on September 19, the day after Anna was found by park rangers, his phone suddenly starts connecting again, but from a completely different location. Chin looked at the map. The new connections were coming from towers near the Nevada state line, more than 100 miles away from the cabin. "He ran," she said quietly. Anna was found on September 18. By the next day, Douglas had fled the area entirely. Torres nodded. "And there's one more thing. On September 20th, 2 days after Anna was rescued, Douglas's phone made a call to a Nevada number registered to a prepaid phone card. The call lasted 47 seconds. 3 days later, that prepaid number was used to call Anna's hospital room at Mercy General in Sacramento. Chin felt her pulse quicken. Do we know what was said? No recording, but the hospital phone log confirms the call came through. It was transferred to Anna's room and lasted approximately 2 minutes before being disconnected. He was checking on her, Chin said, the pieces falling into place. Making sure she'd stuck to the story. Making sure she hadn't told investigators about their connection. Torres pulled up a final image, a comprehensive timeline that laid out Douglas's movements from February through September 2002. The pattern was undeniable. He'd left Nevada in mid-March, positioning himself near Anna's hiking location. He'd remained in the remote cabin area for 6 months while she was held captive there. He'd fled the moment she was discovered. And he'd made contact with her within days of her rescue, despite supposedly not having spoken to his sister in years. Chin printed the entire analysis and added it to the growing case file. The digital trail had done what 4 years of traditional investigation couldn't. It had placed Douglas Archer at the scene of the crime, exposed his alibi as a fabrication, and demonstrated a pattern of behavior consistent with someone who'd planned and executed a long-term kidnapping. But the evidence raised as many questions as it answered. If Douglas had been living at the cabin with Anna for 6 months, what had their relationship been like during that time? Had she been a prisoner from day one, or had something changed? The emails suggested a partnership, a scheme they were both invested in. But Anna's condition when she was found, emaciated, traumatized, chained to a bed, suggested genuine suffering, not theatrical staging. Chin picked up her phone and dialed Lieutenant Brennan. I need a warrant for Douglas Archer's arrest, she said. And I need it today. We've got him on location, we've got him on the timeline, and we've got him lying about his alibi. It's enough to bring him in. Brennan was quiet for a moment. What about Anna? Are we bringing her in too? Chin looked at the map on Torres's screen, at the small red dots marking where Douglas's phone had connected over and over again to towers near that remote cabin. Somewhere in those mountains, a brother and sister had executed a plan that had spiraled horribly out of control. One of them was definitely a criminal. But whether they were both criminals, or whether Anna had truly become a victim of her own scheme, remained to be seen. Not yet, Chin said finally. Let's see what Douglas has to say first. The cabin that had become the focal point of Anna Archer's rescue in September 2002 sat on a parcel of land so remote that most locals didn't even know it existed. Tucked into a narrow valley 12 miles northeast of the main highway, accessible only by a deteriorating logging road that hadn't seen regular use since the 1980s, it was the kind of place people stumbled upon by accident rather than design. The structure itself was modest, a single-room hunting shelter built sometime in the 1950s with rough-hewn walls, a rusted metal roof, and no running water or electricity. When park rangers had found Anna there, chained to that iron bed frame, everyone had assumed the cabin was just what it appeared to be, an abandoned relic that some predator had repurposed for his dark purposes. Detective Riley Chin had never questioned that assumption until now. But as she dug deeper into Douglas Archer's background, one detail kept nagging at her. How had Douglas known about this cabin? It wasn't marked on most maps. It wasn't visible from any trail or road. Finding it required either extensive local knowledge or deliberate searching. And if Douglas had been living in Nevada for years before Anna's disappearance, how had he located such a perfect hiding place? The answer came from the Placer County Assessor's office, and it changed everything. Chin had requested property records for the parcel where the cabin stood, expecting to find it listed as abandoned county land or perhaps owned by the Forest Service. Instead, the records showed a private owner. On November 8, 2001, 4 months before Anna disappeared, the property had been sold in a cash transaction for $18,000. The buyer's name on the deed was Douglas Michael Archer. Chin sat in her car outside the assessor's office, staring at the document she'd just photocopied, trying to process the implications. The cabin wasn't abandoned. Douglas hadn't stumbled upon it or broken into it opportunistically. He'd purchased it. He'd planned this months in advance, acquiring a remote location specifically suited for keeping someone hidden from the world. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or a plan that had been hastily thrown together. This was premeditated, methodical, and terrifyingly calculated. She called Lieutenant Brennan immediately. "The cabin belonged to Douglas," she said without preamble. "He bought it 4 months before Anna vanished. This wasn't random. He was setting the stage." Brennan was silent for a moment, absorbing the information. "Who sold it to him?" Chin checked the deed. "Someone named Jerry Howell, listed as residing in Colfax. I'm heading there now." Jerry Howell turned out to be a retired logger in his 70s, living in a small ranch house on the outskirts of Colfax with his wife, Judy. When Chin knocked on their door that afternoon and explained she was investigating the old cabin property he'd sold in 2001, Howell invited her in with the unhurried hospitality of someone who didn't get many visitors and was happy for the distraction. "That old place," Howell said, settling into a worn recliner in his living room. "I inherited it from my father back in the 80s. He used it as a hunting camp when I was a kid, but after he passed I never had much use for it. Too far out, too much upkeep. My wife kept telling me to sell it, but nobody wanted to buy property that remote. No utilities, terrible road access. It just sat there for years." "Until Douglas Archer contacted you," Chin prompted. Howell nodded. "Late October, early November of 2001. He called me out of the blue, said he'd found the property listing in some old real estate database and was interested in buying it. Said he wanted a place to get away from the world, do some writing, live off the grid for a while. Seemed like an odd fellow, very intense, asked a lot of specific questions about how isolated it was, whether anyone ever came around. But his money was good and I was tired of paying property taxes on land I never used." "He paid cash?" Chin asked. $18,000 in cash, Howell confirmed. "Brought it to the title company in a bank envelope, all $100 bills. The title officer commented on it, said she didn't see cash transactions that size very often anymore. But everything was legal. We signed the papers and the property was his." Chin pulled out a photo of Douglas from his psychiatric hospital records and showed it to Howell. "Is this the man who bought the property?" Howell studied the photo and nodded. "That's him. Older than he looked in person. This must be an old picture. But yeah, that's the fellow. Quiet, kept to himself. Didn't shake hands, I remember that. Just wanted to get the transaction done." "Did you ever see him again after the sale?" Chin asked. Howell shook his head. "Never. Once the property changed hands, I had no reason to go back out there. It wasn't until I saw the news about that girl being found in the cabin that I even thought about the place again. I told Judy at the time, that's my old hunting cabin they're talking about. But I never connected it to the fellow who'd bought it. The news said she'd been held by some drifter, some vagrant who'd broken in. I assumed whoever bought the property had abandoned it, and someone else had taken it over." Chin felt a cold certainty settling over her. "Mr. Howell, the man who bought your property was the girl's brother. He purchased that cabin specifically to hold her prisoner there." Howell's face went pale. His wife, Judy, who'd been listening from the doorway, put a hand to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. "We sold him the place he used to hurt that poor girl." Chin reassured them that they'd had no way of knowing Douglas's intentions and that they bore no responsibility for what he'd done with the property. But as she left the Howell residence, she couldn't shake the image of Douglas Archer walking into that title office with $18,000 in cash, purchasing the instrument of his sister's captivity with the same clinical detachment most people brought to buying a used car. Back at the station, Chin pulled every record she could find related to the cabin property. Utility records showed no electricity or water service had ever been established there, consistent with its off-grid status. But propane delivery records from a local supplier showed that someone, presumably Douglas, had arranged for 2 large propane tanks to be delivered to the property in late November 2001, just after the sale closed. The delivery driver's notes indicated he'd had difficulty finding the location and that a man matching Douglas's description had met him at the main road to guide him in. Chen's next step was to canvass the few residents who lived in the general vicinity of the cabin, hoping someone had noticed activity at the property during the winter of 2001 and spring of 2002. The challenge was that vicinity was a relative term in that part of the Sierra Nevada foothills. The nearest occupied residence was 3 miles away, separated from the cabin by dense forest and steep terrain. She found 2 witnesses who proved crucial. The first was a woman named Hazel Drummond, who lived with her husband in a small homestead about 4 miles south of the cabin property. Hazel explained that she and her husband took long walks through the forest several times a week, often covering 8 or 10 miles along old logging roads and game trails. In December 2001 and January 2002, she'd noticed fresh tire tracks on the logging road that led toward the old Howell property. "I remember thinking someone must have bought the place," Hazel told Chin. "The road hadn't been used in years, all overgrown, but suddenly there were tracks like someone with a truck was going in and out pretty regularly. I mentioned it to my husband, said maybe we'd have new neighbors. But we never saw anyone, and eventually the tracks stopped appearing as regularly." More significantly, Hazel recalled seeing smoke rising from the direction of the cabin on several occasions during that winter. "You could see it from the ridge near our property on clear days," she said. "Thin column of smoke like someone had a wood stove going. It made sense if someone was fixing the place up, trying to make it livable." The second witness was a local handyman named Christopher Yates, who did odd jobs and small construction projects throughout the area. In late January 2002, he'd been hired by Douglas Archer, though Yates hadn't known his name at the time, to deliver and install several items at a remote cabin. The job had been arranged by phone, and Douglas had paid cash in advance. He wanted heavy-duty chains and mounting hardware installed in the cabin, Yates told Chin. Said he was setting up a secure storage system for valuable equipment. Asked me to bolt anchor points into the floor joists and the wall studs. I thought it was a weird request, but people do strange things with their properties, and the money was good. $500 for half a day's work. Chin felt her stomach turn. "Did you install the chains?" Yates nodded, looking uncomfortable now that he understood the context. 4 anchor points with heavy chain attached. He was very specific about where they should go and how strong they needed to be. Kept saying they had to support at least 200 pounds of dynamic weight. I figured maybe he was worried about bears getting into his supplies or something. People get paranoid about wildlife out there. "Did you see anything else at the cabin?" Chin asked. "Supplies," Yates said. "Lots of them. Cases of bottled water, canned food, propane heaters. He had a generator too, still in the box. The place looked like he was prepping for a long-term stay somewhere with no infrastructure." Chen asked Yates to provide a written statement and to testify if necessary. He agreed, visibly shaken by the realization that he'd unwittingly helped prepare a prison. The evidence was now overwhelming. Douglas hadn't improvised or adapted an existing location. He'd purchased property specifically for this purpose, equipped it with restraints, stocked it with supplies, and positioned it in a location so remote that Anna's screams would never reach another human being. The isolation wasn't accidental, it was the entire point. He'd chosen the cabin the way a spider chooses the location for its web, with predatory precision. Chen compiled all the property records, witness statements, and delivery receipts into a comprehensive report. The cabin's secret was out. It had never been abandoned, never been a random location. It was a carefully selected, meticulously prepared prison, purchased and equipped months before Anna Archer ever set foot on that hiking trail. And that level of forethought suggested something even darker than Chen had initially suspected. This wasn't just a kidnapping scheme that had gone wrong. This was a trap that had been set with cold deliberation, and Anna had walked into it willingly, never realizing that her unstable brother had been planning something far more permanent than the 2-week staged captivity they discussed in their emails. Douglas Archer was arrested on a Tuesday morning in late May 2006, nearly 4 years after his sister had been found chained in that remote cabin. He was living in a rundown apartment complex in Sparks, Nevada, working night shifts at a warehouse that distributed automotive parts. The arrest team, Detective Riley Chin, 2 local deputies, and an FBI agent brought in because of the kidnapping charges, knocked on his door at 6 a.m., when they knew he'd be home from his overnight shift but still awake. Douglas answered the door in a stained t-shirt and work pants, looking older than his 39 years. His hair had gone mostly gray, and his face carried the gaunt, weathered look of someone who'd spent too many years running on too little sleep and too much stress. When Chen identified herself and informed him that he was under arrest for the kidnapping and false imprisonment of Anna Archer, his expression didn't register surprise. Instead, something that looked almost like relief passed across his features, as if he'd been waiting for this moment and was tired of anticipating it. He didn't resist. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He simply turned around, allowed the deputies to handcuff him, and walked quietly to the unmarked car waiting in the parking lot. The extradition process took 2 days, during which Douglas was held in the Washoe County Jail without incident. Chin used that time to prepare her interrogation strategy, reviewing every piece of evidence they'd compiled, the emails, the property records, the cell tower data, the witness statements. She wanted Douglas to understand that denial was pointless, that they already knew most of the story and were simply filling in the final details. When Douglas was finally transported to the Placer County Sheriff's Department and placed in an interrogation room, Chin let him sit alone for 20 minutes before entering. It was a standard technique, designed to let the suspect's anxiety build. But when she walked into the room with Lieutenant Brennan, she found Douglas sitting calmly at the metal table, his cuffed hands folded in front of him, looking less like a man awaiting interrogation and more like someone preparing for confession. Chin started with the basics, establishing the date, time, and presence of all parties for the recording. She read Douglas his Miranda rights and asked if he understood them. He nodded and said he did. She asked if he wanted an attorney present. Douglas looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "I think it's time I told someone the truth. I've been carrying it alone for too long." Chin exchanged a glance with Brennan, surprised by the immediate capitulation but wary of it. Sometimes suspects confessed quickly because they were genuinely remorseful. Other times, they rushed to tell their version of events to get ahead of the evidence, to spin the narrative in a way that minimized their culpability. "Mr. Archer," Chin began, "we have evidence placing you at the location where your sister Anna was held captive in 2002. We have records showing you purchased that property months in advance. We have emails between you and Anna discussing a plan. Before we go any further, I want to give you an opportunity to tell us, in your own words, what happened." Douglas closed his eyes and took a long breath as if gathering strength. When he opened them again, his expression was a mixture of anger and exhaustion. "It was her idea," he said. "All of it. People need to know that. I didn't kidnap my sister. She came to me. She planned the whole thing." Chin kept her expression neutral, though her pulse quickened. This was the break she'd been hoping for, but she needed to let Douglas tell it his way without interruption. "Start from the beginning," she said. "When did Anna first contact you?" Douglas's jaw tightened. "February 2002. I got an email out of nowhere from an address I didn't recognize, but when I opened it, it was from Anna. We hadn't spoken in almost 7 years, not since the thing with our father. She said she'd been thinking about me, that she knew what had happened wasn't fair, that I'd been cut out of everything while she got all the benefits of being the golden child. She said she wanted to make it right." "Make it right how?" Chin asked. "Money," Douglas said flatly. "She was drowning in debt. Credit cards, student loans, a car payment she couldn't afford. She tried asking our parents for help, but they'd refused, said she needed to learn financial responsibility. But they had millions, you understand? Our father's real estate business, our mother's trust funds. And they were sitting on all that money while their daughter was struggling and their son had been thrown away like garbage." His voice had taken on an edge of bitterness that made Chin think of the psychiatric reports, the descriptions of Douglas's paranoid resentment toward his family. Whatever progress he'd made in the hospital, it clearly hadn't eliminated the core grievances that drove him. "So Anna proposed a plan," Chin said, prompting him to continue. Douglas nodded. "She said we could stage a kidnapping. Make it look like she'd been abducted by a stranger. Our parents would pay whatever ransom was demanded. They had the money and they loved Anna, their precious daughter. Once we got the ransom, we'd split it. She'd be found, claim she escaped or was released, and everyone would move on. Our parents would get their daughter back, Anna would have her debts paid off, and I'd finally get some of what I was owed." "And you agreed," Chin said. "Of course I agreed," Douglas said, his voice rising slightly. "For 7 years I'd had nothing. I'd been hospitalized, medicated, told I was crazy for believing my family had stolen from me. And then suddenly my sister, the one who'd taken everything, was offering to share. Was offering to acknowledge what had been done to me. How could I refuse?" Chin let the silence stretch, watching Douglas's face as he processed his own justification. Then she asked the critical question. "What happened after that initial contact?" Douglas's expression darkened. "We planned it for weeks. Anna found the property listing for cabins in the area, and I used money from my grandmother's trust to buy one. Anna told me exactly how she wanted it set up, remote, hard to find, but not impossible. She even sent me a list of supplies to buy. Food, water, chains for the restraints. She said it had to look authentic, that when she was found, There had to be evidence of real captivity. Otherwise the police wouldn't believe it and our parents might not pay. So Anna knew about the chains, Chin said, making sure to get this on record. She insisted on them, Douglas said. She said handcuffs or rope would look staged like something from a movie. But heavy chains, the kind you'd use for securing equipment or livestock, those would look like something a real predator would use. She was very specific about it. Chin thought about the scene the Rangers had discovered. Anna emaciated, filthy, chained to that bed frame. If Douglas was telling the truth, Anna had orchestrated her own nightmarish tableau. When did she come to the cabin? March 18th, Douglas said. She drove to the trailhead like she was going hiking just like we planned. I picked her up at a spot about 2 miles in, where the trail crosses an old fire road. She got in my truck and we drove to the cabin. She was nervous but determined. She kept saying it would only be 2 weeks, that we just had to hold out for 2 weeks while the ransom demand was delivered and our parents arranged the payment. And then what? Brennan asked, speaking for the first time. Douglas's face changed, becoming something harder and more distant. Then everything fell apart. Chin leaned forward slightly. What do you mean? The first week was fine, Douglas said slowly. Anna stayed in the cabin. I brought her food and water. She wrote the ransom note herself, very specific about how much to ask for and where to deliver it. $200,000, she said. Not so much that our parents couldn't raise it quickly, but enough to make a real difference for both of us. I delivered the note the way she instructed, left it in her car at the trailhead where the police would find it when they started searching. He paused, his hands gripping the edge of the table. The money came through in about 3 weeks. Our parents paid it, left it at a drop site in a state park like the note said. I retrieved it and that should have been the end. I was supposed to drive Anna back to a spot near a different trailhead, let her walk out to a road and she'd claim she'd escaped. We'd go our separate ways, never contact each other again. The plan was perfect. But you didn't let her go, Chin said. Douglas's jaw worked, and for a moment Chin thought he might stop talking, might finally ask for that lawyer. But instead, he looked directly at her, and what she saw in his eyes was something close to desperation. I couldn't, he said. I wanted to, God knows I wanted to. But I started thinking about what would happen after. Anna would be free, she'd have her share of the money, she'd go back to her life. And what did I have? I'd be alone again, with no one who understood what our family had done to me. And Anna knew everything. She knew I'd helped her, knew where I lived, knew every detail of the plan. What if she decided I was a liability? What if she went to the police and claimed I'd actually kidnapped her, that none of it was staged? So you kept her prisoner, Brennan said, his voice cold. For 6 months. I had to think, Douglas said, his voice rising defensively. I needed time to figure out what to do. And the longer she was there, the more I realized she'd been using me. This whole thing had been about her getting money, not about making things right with me. She didn't care that I'd been cut off from the family. She just needed an accomplice who was desperate enough to go along with a crazy plan. Chin felt a surge of controlled anger but kept her voice level. Mr. Archer, you're claiming this started as a mutual arrangement, but the evidence shows you purchased the cabin and installed restraints months before Anna contacted you. How do you explain that? Douglas blinked, caught off guard by the timeline question. That's not right. The cabin was purchased after we started planning. Property records show you bought it in November 2001, Chin said. Anna didn't contact you until February 2002. That's 3 months of preparation before she ever reached out. For the first time, Douglas's certainty wavered. He stared at the table, his breathing becoming more rapid. I was making plans in case she'd mentioned before that. He trailed off, and Chin saw the moment when his own narrative collapsed under the weight of objective evidence. Whatever story Douglas had been telling himself about being Anna's victim, about being manipulated into helping her, it couldn't account for the premeditation the property records revealed. Mr. Archer, Chin said quietly, did Anna really contact you first or did you reach out to her? Douglas looked up, and his expression had changed from defensive certainty to something more fragmented and confused. It's hard to remember exactly how it started. My memories from that time aren't always clear. The medication they had me on at the hospital, it affected things. Chin exchanged a glance with Brennan. They were watching a confession begin to unravel, and they needed to lock in what they had before Douglas shut down completely or realized he needed legal representation. "What we know for certain," Chin said, "is that you held your sister captive for 6 months in a cabin you'd purchased and prepared specifically for that purpose. Whatever the original plan may have been, you betrayed it. You kept the money and kept her prisoner. Is that accurate?" Douglas closed his eyes, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes, that's accurate." Douglas Archer's confession had been a breakthrough, but Detective Riley Chin knew better than to accept any suspect's version of events at face value. Confessions were narratives, and narratives were shaped by self-interest, by the need to minimize culpability or shift blame. Douglas claimed Anna had orchestrated everything, that he'd been manipulated into helping her execute a scheme that had spiraled beyond his control. But the property records contradicted his timeline, and Chin suspected there were other contradictions waiting to be discovered. The cabin had been left largely undisturbed since Anna's rescue in 2002. After the initial investigation concluded and the case went cold, the property had been sealed as evidence, though nobody expected it would ever be relevant again. Now, with Douglas in custody and Anna's role in question, Chin ordered a comprehensive forensic examination of the site. She wanted every surface processed for fingerprints, every item cataloged and analyzed, every detail that had been overlooked during the original investigation brought into sharp focus. The forensic team arrived at the cabin on a gray morning in early June 2006, led by a senior crime scene technician named Daniel Voss. Voss had 20 years of experience and a reputation for meticulousness that bordered on obsessive. Chin accompanied him, along with Lieutenant Brennan and 2 additional technicians who would photograph and document everything before any evidence was collected. The cabin looked exactly as Chin remembered from the photographs in the case file. A single room with rough wooden walls, a small wood stove in one corner, and the iron bed frame where Anna had been found. The chains that had held her were still there, secured to anchor bolts in the floor and wall. 4 years of abandonment had left the interior covered in dust and cobwebs, but the essential crime scene remained intact. Voss began with the chains themselves, photographing them from multiple angles before carefully examining the padlock that had secured Anna to the bed frame. It was a heavy-duty commercial lock, the kind used for securing industrial equipment or storage facilities. Voss dusted it with fingerprint powder, working slowly and methodically, and within minutes had lifted several clear prints from the metal surface. "These will need to be compared against the database," Voss said, carefully transferring the prints to evidence cards. "But I'm seeing multiple overlapping prints, which suggest this lock was handled repeatedly by the same person or persons." Chin nodded, watching as Voss moved to the chain links themselves, then to the anchor bolts in the floor. More prints emerged, layer upon layer of them, some clear and others smudged beyond usefulness. The bed frame yielded prints as well, particularly on the metal rails where someone would naturally grip when climbing onto or off the mattress. But it was when Voss examined the exterior casing of the padlock, the part that would have been visible and accessible to someone who wasn't restrained, that he found something unexpected. He paused, studying the print through his magnifying lens, then looked up at Chen with an expression of professional curiosity. "This is interesting," he said. "I've got a very clear thumbprint on the exterior of the lock mechanism, right where you'd place your thumb if you were closing or opening it. This print wasn't made by someone testing if the lock was secure. This was made by someone operating the lock." Chin felt her pulse quicken. "Can you tell how old it is?" "Not from visual examination alone," Voss said. "But the placement and clarity suggest it was made before the lock was closed for the final time. If someone had touched this spot after Anna was found and the chains were removed, we'd expect to see disturbance in the dust pattern. This print appears to be from the original crime scene timeframe. The implications were immediate and troubling. If someone had handled the locking mechanism before Anna was restrained, it suggested she hadn't been forcibly chained while resisting. It suggested she'd been present and possibly complicit in her own restraint." Voss spent the next 6 hours processing every surface in the cabin. He found prints on the door frame, on the handles of the propane heater, on empty water bottles and food containers that had been left in a corner. Some were smudged or partial, but many were clear enough for identification. All of them would need to be run through the automated fingerprint identification system and compared against Anna's prints on file as well as Douglas's. While the forensic team worked inside the cabin, Chen and Brennan searched the surrounding property. They found evidence of Douglas's long-term presence. A tent platform about 50 yards from the cabin where he'd apparently slept during the warmer months, a fire pit with the remnants of dozens of meals, and a makeshift latrine even farther back in the woods. But they also found something else. A small storage shed near the logging road, secured with another padlock. Brennan cut the lock with bolt cutters and they pulled open the shed door. Inside were more supplies, cases of bottled water, canned goods, batteries, propane canisters. But buried beneath a tarp in the back corner was a cardboard box filled with receipts and documents. Chin pulled it out and began sorting through the contents. Most of the receipts were for the supplies they'd expected: food, water, propane, the chains and hardware that had been used to restrain Anna. But several receipts stood out because they weren't in Douglas's name. They were made out to Anna Archer, with her signature clearly visible on the credit card slips. Chin laid them out on the hood of her car, photographing each one. A receipt from REI dated February 28, 2002, for camping supplies including a high-end sleeping bag, water purification tablets, and freeze-dried meals. A receipt from a hardware store on March 5, 2002 for heavy-duty padlocks, the same brand as the one that had secured Anna to the bed. A receipt from a grocery store on March 10, 2002, for $70 worth of non-perishable food items. She was buying supplies for her own captivity, Brennan said quietly, looking over Chen's shoulder. Douglas wasn't lying about that part. Chen pulled Anna's bank records from her case file and cross-referenced them with the receipts. On February 25, 2002, Anna had withdrawn $3,000 in cash from her checking account in a single ATM transaction. The withdrawal had drained her account to nearly zero, which was consistent with Douglas's claim that she'd been in serious financial trouble. But it also suggested she'd been preparing to fund the operation, converting her remaining assets into untraceable cash. The forensic results came back 3 days later, and they confirmed what Chen had begun to suspect. The thumbprint on the padlock's exterior casing was a match for Anna Archer's right thumb. Several other prints found throughout the cabin also matched Anna's, including prints on the door handle, on the wood stove, and on multiple food containers. The distribution and placement of the prints suggested that Anna had moved freely throughout the cabin at some point, handling items and operating the lock mechanism herself. But there was more. Voss's team had found a second set of prints that belonged to Douglas, and their pattern told a different story. Douglas's prints were concentrated near the door, on the exterior of the lock, and on the supply containers. But they were largely absent from the bed frame itself and from the interior surface of the chains. It was as if Douglas had been bringing supplies to the cabin and securing the door, but hadn't been the one physically restraining Anna. Chin sat in the conference room with Brennan and the district attorney, a sharp woman named Susan Portman who would ultimately decide what charges to file and against whom. They spread the evidence across the table: the receipts signed by Anna, the fingerprint analysis showing she'd handled the lock mechanism, the bank records showing her cash withdrawal, and Douglas's confession claiming the kidnapping had been Anna's idea. "This doesn't look like a straightforward victim," Portman said, studying the documents. "Anna's fingerprints are on the lock that supposedly held her prisoner. She purchased supplies for an extended stay in a remote location. She withdrew cash that appears to have funded the operation. And she wrote ransom letters herself, according to Douglas's statement. But she was genuinely injured when we found her," Chin countered. "Malnourished, dehydrated, traumatized. She'd lost almost 30 pounds. Her condition wasn't staged, that was real suffering." "Which suggests something went wrong," Brennan said. "Maybe it started as a con like Douglas claims, but then he actually kept her prisoner. The question is whether Anna's initial participation negates her status as a victim." Portman shook her head. "That's not the question. The question is whether Anna committed crimes herself. Conspiracy to commit fraud, filing false police reports, obstruction of justice. If she helped plan this kidnapping, even if Douglas ultimately betrayed her, she's still criminally liable for the scheme." Chin knew Portman was right, but something still bothered her about the narrative. Yes, Anna's fingerprints were on the lock. Yes, she'd purchased supplies. But the forensic evidence also showed extensive signs of her having been restrained for months. Ligature marks on her wrists and ankles that had scarred, evidence of prolonged malnutrition, psychological trauma that her therapists had documented. Whatever Anna had agreed to initially, what she'd endured went far beyond a staged 2-week captivity. "We need to interview her again," Chin said. Confront her with this evidence and hear her version of events. Douglas's confession is self-serving, and Anna's original statement was a lie. We need the truth from both of them. Portman nodded. Bring her in. But be prepared for the possibility that your victim is also a perpetrator. This case just got a lot more complicated. Chen left the meeting and drove to Sacramento, where Anna had been living for the past 4 years. The woman who answered the door of the modest apartment looked older than her 27 years, her blonde hair cut short now, her frame still too thin. When Anna saw Chen's badge, the color drained from her face. We need to talk, Chen said. And this time, I need you to tell me the truth about what really happened in that cabin. Anna's hands trembled as she gripped the doorframe. For a long moment she didn't speak. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, I've been waiting for this. I knew someone would figure it out eventually. She stepped aside, and Chen walked into the apartment, knowing that whatever Anna said next would determine whether she would be remembered as a victim who survived or a conspirator who got caught. Anna Archer sat across from Detective Riley Chen in the same interrogation room where Douglas had confessed 2 weeks earlier, but her demeanor was entirely different from her brother's. Where Douglas had seemed almost relieved to unburden himself, Anna radiated barely controlled panic. Her hands wouldn't stop moving, smoothing her hair, picking at her cuticles, gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Chen had seen this kind of anxiety before, in people who knew their carefully constructed lives were about to collapse. Chen had brought Lieutenant Brennan and Assistant District Attorney Susan Portman to observe from behind the two-way mirror. This interview would determine whether Anna Archer would be charged as a co-conspirator or remain classified as a victim. Everything depended on how she responded to the evidence they'd uncovered. After establishing the preliminaries for the recording, Chen opened a manila folder and spread several documents across the table between them. She did it slowly, deliberately, giving Anna time to register what she was seeing. Bank statements, ATM withdrawal records, credit card receipts bearing Anna's signature, forensic photographs of fingerprints lifted from the cabin, with analysis reports matching them to Anna's prints on file. Anna stared at the documents, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. I don't understand, she said, though the tremor in her voice suggested she understood perfectly. Why are you showing me this? Because we need to talk about what really happened in 2002, Chen said, keeping her tone neutral but firm. And I need you to be honest with me this time, Anna. Your brother has already told us his version of events. Now I need to hear yours. Anna's eyes widened. Douglas? You found Douglas. We arrested him 3 weeks ago, Chen said. He's been very forthcoming about the planning that went into your disappearance. About the emails you exchanged. About the cabin he purchased. About the kidnapping scheme you both participated in. No, Anna said quickly, shaking her head. That's not what happened. Douglas kidnapped me. He held me prisoner. He's lying if he said anything different. Chen picked up one of the receipts and slid it directly in front of Anna. This is your signature, dated March 5, 2002, for the purchase of 2 heavy-duty padlocks from Wallace Hardware in Sacramento. Those padlocks were found at the cabin. One of them was used to secure the chains that held you to the bed frame. Why were you purchasing locks 2 weeks before you disappeared? Anna looked at the receipt, and Chen watched as the woman's carefully maintained composure began to fracture. I don't remember buying those. Maybe someone stole my credit card. The receipt shows you signed for it, Chen said. And the store's security footage from that date, which we've reviewed, shows you making the purchase in person. There's also this receipt from REI for camping supplies, and this one from Safeway for $70 worth of canned goods. All dated in the weeks before your disappearance. All signed by you. Anna's hands were shaking now, her fingers clutching the edge of the table so hard her knuckles had gone white. I went camping a lot back then. Those purchases don't prove anything. Chen pulled out another set of photographs, close-ups of the padlock with fingerprint powder revealing the distinctive whorls and ridges of a thumbprint. Next to it was Anna's fingerprint card from her original victim statement, with circles drawn around matching points of identification. This is your thumbprint, Chen said, tapping the photograph. On the exterior of the padlock mechanism. Not on the inside where someone being restrained might accidentally touch it while struggling. On the outside where you'd place your thumb if you were operating the lock yourself. The forensic analysis indicates this print was made before the lock was closed for the final time. You handled that lock, Anna. You knew how it worked. You weren't just a prisoner, you were part of the setup. Anna stared at the photographs, and Chin saw the moment when the fight went out of her. Her shoulders sagged, her face crumpled, and tears began streaming down her cheeks. For several long seconds she didn't speak, just sat there crying silently while Chin waited. He said nobody would ever figure it out, Anna finally whispered. He said if we both stuck to the story, there was no way anyone could prove what really happened. Chin felt a surge of adrenaline but kept her expression carefully neutral. Why don't you tell me what really happened, Anna? From the beginning. Anna wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing mascara across her cheek. When she spoke again, her voice was raw with emotion. I was drowning. Financially, emotionally, I was completely drowning. I had $40,000 in credit card debt, student loans I couldn't pay, and my parents refused to help me. They had millions, but they said I needed to learn to stand on my own. Meanwhile, I was working 60 hours a week just to make minimum payments and still falling further behind every month. She paused, struggling to compose herself. I kept thinking about Douglas, about how our parents had cut him off and given everything to me. And I realized that they'd put me in an impossible position, given me all the responsibility of the family legacy but none of the resources to handle it. I thought maybe if they saw me in real danger, if they thought they might lose me, they'd finally help. So you contacted Douglas, Chin said. Anna nodded. I knew he hated them. Hated me too, probably. But I also knew he needed money and that he'd understand what it felt like to be abandoned by them. I found his email address through an old family contact list and reached out in February. At first he didn't respond. Then after a week he wrote back. He was cautious at first, but when I explained what I wanted to do, he was interested. What exactly did you propose? Chin asked. A staged kidnapping, Anna said, her voice steadying slightly as she fell into the familiar territory of confession. I'd go on a hiking trip, disappear, and Douglas would send a ransom demand. $200,000, enough to clear my debts and give Douglas a fresh start. We'd split it evenly. I'd stay hidden for 2 weeks, then Douglas would let me go somewhere I could be found. I'd claim a stranger had taken me, give a vague description that couldn't be traced, and everyone would move on. My parents would get their daughter back, and I'd have a chance to start over without the debt crushing me. And Douglas agreed to this plan, Chin said. Not immediately, Anna said. He was paranoid about it going wrong, about getting caught. But I convinced him it could work. I told him I'd handle all the details, I'd buy the supplies, set everything up, make it look authentic. All he had to do was find a location and stay with me to make sure I was safe during the 2 weeks. I even wrote out the ransom note myself, told him exactly what to say and where to leave it. Chin pulled out copies of the emails they'd recovered from Anna's work account and slid them across the table. These emails discuss the plan and making it look real. That's what you were talking about. Anna glanced at the emails and nodded, fresh tears spilling down her face. Yes. We spent weeks planning every detail. Douglas found the cabin and bought it with money from some trust fund his grandmother had left him. I helped him figure out what supplies we'd need. The chains, the locks, the food and water. I even specified that it had to be heavy chains, not rope or handcuffs, because it needed to look like something a real kidnapper would use. So you purchased the locks yourself, Chin said. I purchased everything I could, Anna said. Douglas was worried about leaving a paper trail, so I used my credit cards for most of the supplies. We both thought that if investigators ever did look into it, purchases made by me weeks before my disappearance would just look like normal camping preparation. Nobody would connect them to the kidnapping. Chin leaned back slightly, processing this. Everything Douglas had claimed was being confirmed by Anna herself. The plan had been mutual. The preparation had been collaborative. But there was still the question of what had gone wrong. You said the plan was for 2 weeks, Chin said. But you were held in that cabin for 6 months. What happened? Anna's face contorted with a mixture of anger and anguish. Douglas changed. That's what happened. The first week was fine, uncomfortable but manageable. I stayed in the cabin, he brought me food and water twice a day, and we waited for the ransom demand to be delivered. The money came through faster than we expected. 3 weeks after I disappeared, Douglas told me our parents had paid. He showed me the cash, $200,000 in bills, exactly what we'd asked for. He said we'd wait a few more days to make sure it wasn't a trap, Then he'd drive me to a different trailhead and let me walk out to a road. She stopped, her breath hitching. But those few days turned into a week. Then 2 weeks. I kept asking when he was going to let me go, and he kept making excuses. He said the police were still searching too actively, that we needed to wait until things quieted down. But I could see it in his eyes. Something had shifted. He was looking at me differently, like I was an enemy instead of a partner. Did he explain why he wasn't releasing you? Chen asked. Eventually, Anna said bitterly. After I'd been there for almost 2 months, I demanded to know what was happening. I told him I was done, that I wanted out regardless of the risks. And that's when he told me the truth. He said he couldn't trust me anymore. He said that as soon as he let me go, I'd turn on him and tell the police everything, that I'd claim he really had kidnapped me and keep all the money for myself. He said I'd taken everything from him our whole lives, and he wasn't going to let me do it again. Tears were flowing freely now, and Anna's voice had risen to a near sob. I tried to reason with him. I swore I wouldn't say anything, that we had a deal. But he wouldn't listen. His paranoia just got worse and worse. He started feeding me less, saying he needed to conserve supplies. He'd go days without visiting, leaving me chained to that bed with barely any water. I begged him to let me go. I screamed until my voice gave out. But there was nobody around to hear me, and Douglas just kept saying he needed more time to think. Chen watched Anna carefully, seeing genuine trauma in her expression but also calculating how much of this confession was strategic, an attempt to frame herself as Douglas's victim rather than his accomplice. How did you finally get found? I didn't escape, Anna said quietly. Douglas left me there. By August I was so weak I could barely move. I'd lost so much weight that the chains were loose on my wrists. Douglas would come by maybe once a week, bring me some food and water, check that I was still alive. He looked terrible too, like the whole thing was destroying him as much as it was destroying me. Then one day in September he came to the cabin and told me he was sorry, that he didn't know how to fix what he'd done. He said he was going to leave me where rangers might find me, and after that, he was disappearing for good. He staged your discovery, Chen said. Anna nodded. He built a small fire outside the cabin, knowing the smoke would eventually attract attention. He made sure I was still chained but loosened the lock slightly so the rangers would be able to free me without needing to cut the chains. Then he told me what to say, that a stranger in camouflage had taken me, that he'd dragged Mike into the woods. Except there was no Mike. We made that whole detail up to make the story more believable, to give investigators something to search for. Chen felt a chill at hearing Anna casually discuss fabricating details of her own kidnapping, including the fictional disappearance of a non-existent victim. And you agreed to stick to that story. What choice did I have? Anna said, her voice breaking. I was half dead, chained to a bed in the middle of nowhere. Douglas said if I told anyone the truth, he'd tell them I'd planned the whole thing, that I'd stolen the ransom money. He said nobody would believe I was a real victim because I'd helped set everything up. So yes, I agreed. I told the story he wanted me to tell. And for 4 years I've lived with that lie. She looked directly at Chin, her eyes red and swollen. But you have to understand, the plan was supposed to be fake. 2 weeks of staged captivity, then freedom and enough money to start over. Douglas made it real. He actually imprisoned me. He kept me in that cabin for 6 months, starving me, leaving me to suffer. I was part of the plan, but I became his victim. Both things are true. Chen closed the folder, her expression unreadable. Anna's confession had been detailed and damning, corroborating Douglas's version while also revealing the full scope of her participation. The fingerprints made sense now. The purchases made sense. The staged discovery made sense. What remained to be determined was whether Anna's genuine suffering during those 6 months of captivity would mitigate her culpability for initiating the scheme that led to it. Anna Archer, Chen said formally, I need to inform you that based on your statement today, you're being placed under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, filing false police reports, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent. I know, Anna interrupted quietly. I've known this was coming for 4 years. As Chin read her the rest of her Miranda rights and called for an officer to process her into custody, she couldn't help but think that this case had no real winners. A brother and sister had conspired to betray their parents, and in doing so had destroyed each other. Douglas's paranoia had turned a scam into a genuine crime, and Anna's desperation had led her to trust the one person in her life who was guaranteed to make things worse. The only certainty was that both of them would pay for what they'd done, even if the costs had already been devastating long before the law caught up with them. With both Douglas and Anna Archer in custody and their confessions on record, Detective Riley Chin spent 2 weeks reconstructing the complete timeline of the conspiracy. She compiled every piece of evidence: emails, financial records, witness statements, cell tower data, forensic reports, into a comprehensive narrative that would be presented to the grand jury. What emerged was a story of desperation, manipulation, mental illness, and a plan that had transformed from calculated fraud into genuine horror. The genesis of the scheme could be traced to late 2001, though pinpointing exactly who had initiated contact first remained murky. Douglas claimed Anna had reached out to him. Anna claimed Douglas had sent the first email. The archived correspondence suggested both were partially lying and partially telling the truth. The earliest recovered email was from Anna, but it referenced a previous communication that had been permanently deleted. What mattered was that by December 2001, both siblings were actively planning something they hoped would solve their respective problems. Anna's problems were financial and emotional. At 26, she was earning $45,000 a year as a marketing coordinator in Sacramento, a salary that should have been sufficient for a reasonable lifestyle. But Anna had accumulated massive debt during her college years and early 20s, credit cards maxed out at $42,000, student loans totaling $38,000, a car payment she could barely afford, and rent in a city where housing costs were rising faster than wages. Her minimum monthly payments exceeded $2,000, leaving her constantly broke despite working overtime and taking freelance projects. She'd asked her parents for help in November 2001, driving to their Granite Bay home for what she'd hoped would be a productive conversation about her situation. Instead, according to Anna's own testimony, her father had lectured her about financial responsibility and refused to offer assistance despite having an estimated net worth of $12 million. "You need to learn to live within your means," he'd told her. "We gave you every advantage growing up. If you've squandered those advantages, that's your problem to solve." The rejection had been devastating, not just financially but emotionally. Anna felt her parents had set impossible expectations. They'd raised her to pursue her dreams, attend expensive schools, and maintain a lifestyle appropriate to their social class, but then withdrawn support the moment she struggled to sustain it independently. The inequality of it infuriated her. Her parents lived in a 6,000-square-foot house and took European vacations while their daughter was choosing between paying rent and buying groceries. That's when she'd thought of Douglas. Douglas's problems ran deeper than money, though poverty certainly amplified them. After being cut from the family inheritance in 1995 and subsequently hospitalized in 1998, he'd spent 3 years as a psychiatric patient at Napa State Hospital. His diagnosis of paranoid personality disorder meant he experienced the world through a lens of constant suspicion and resentment. Treatment had helped manage the worst symptoms, but the underlying cognitive patterns remained. Douglas genuinely believed his family had conspired to steal what was rightfully his, that Anna had been favored throughout their lives at his expense, and that he was owed compensation for years of mistreatment. When Anna contacted him in late 2001 or early 2002, she'd inadvertently activated every paranoid grievance Douglas had been nursing for years. But she'd also offered him something he desperately wanted: validation. Anna was acknowledging that their parents were wrong, that the inheritance situation was unfair, that Douglas deserved better. For someone whose entire adult life had been defined by being told his perceptions were delusional, having his sister confirm them felt like vindication. The emails between them showed the conspiracy developing gradually. Anna's early messages were cautious, testing whether Douglas would be receptive to reconnecting. Douglas's responses were guarded but interested. By late January 2002, they were discussing their shared resentment of their parents in increasingly explicit terms. Anna floated the idea of a staged kidnapping almost casually. "What if they thought they might lose me? Would they finally understand how badly they failed us both?" Douglas had been skeptical at first, seeing too many ways it could go wrong. But Anna was persistent, addressing each of his objections with solutions. They wouldn't ask for so much money that their parents couldn't raise it quickly. The location would be remote enough to avoid detection but not so isolated that Anna would be in real danger. They'd keep it short, 2 weeks maximum, so the risk of discovery remained minimal. Most importantly, Anna would handle the details that required her personal information, reducing Douglas's exposure. The planning phase consumed February and early March of 2002. Douglas used $18,000 from his grandmother's trust to purchase the cabin property, following specifications Anna had provided about remoteness and accessibility. Anna bought supplies using her credit cards, calculating that normal camping purchases wouldn't raise suspicion if anyone looked into her activities before the disappearance. They communicated through email and prepaid cell phones, avoiding any contact that could be traced back to established accounts. The execution began on March 18, 2002. Anna drove to the trailhead in the Sierra Nevada foothills, signed the register under her own name, and hiked 2 miles to a predetermined spot where an old fire road intersected the trail. Douglas met her there in a pickup truck he'd purchased with cash 2 weeks earlier. According to both their testimonies, Anna climbed into the truck voluntarily, and they drove together to the cabin. What happened during those first days matched what both siblings described: uncomfortable but manageable. Anna stayed in the cabin while Douglas slept in a tent outside. She wasn't chained initially. That detail was added on day 3 when they decided the eventual rescue needed to look authentic. Anna had specified heavy chains rather than handcuffs or rope because, as she told Douglas, it needs to look like something a real predator would use, not something theatrical. The ransom demand was delivered on March 25, exactly 1 week after Anna's disappearance. Douglas had driven to the trailhead under cover of darkness and placed the note inside Anna's car, which had already been discovered by searchers and was under sporadic surveillance. The note, written in Anna's handwriting but designed to look like forced dictation, demanded $200,000 in unmarked bills, with detailed instructions for a drop location in a state park 40 miles away. Robert and Margaret Archer paid immediately. Despite their earlier refusal to help Anna with her debts, the threat of losing their daughter unlocked their resources without hesitation. They liquidated investments and delivered the money to the specified location on April 8, 2002, 3 weeks after the ransom demand. Douglas retrieved it the following day, confirming that $200,000 in cash was now in his possession. This should have been the end. According to their plan, Douglas would wait a few days to ensure the money wasn't marked or tracked, then drive Anna to a different trailhead and release her. She'd stumble to a road, flag down a motorist, and claim she'd escaped from her captor. Investigators would search for a phantom kidnapper while Anna and Douglas quietly split the money and went their separate ways. But Douglas didn't release her. The first excuse was plausible: he wanted to wait until the active search operations died down, which made tactical sense. But days turned into weeks, and Anna's questions about when she'd be freed were met with increasingly paranoid deflections. Douglas began expressing doubts about her loyalty, suggesting she might turn on him despite their agreement. He'd pace outside the cabin at night, talking to himself in conversations Anna could hear through the thin walls, arguing with invisible adversaries who were apparently convincing him that Anna was planning to betray him. By May, 2 months after the kidnapping, Douglas's behavior had deteriorated significantly. He'd stopped maintaining basic hygiene, his speech had become disorganized, and his visits to the cabin grew erratic. Sometimes he'd bring food and water daily. Other times he'd disappear for 3 or 4 days, leaving Anna chained to the bed with minimal supplies. When she confronted him, demanding to be released, he became agitated and defensive, accusing her of lying about her intentions. "You're just like them," he told her during one heated argument in June. "You used me to get what you wanted, and now you'll throw me away just like our parents did. You think I'm stupid enough to let that happen?" Anna's attempts to reason with him failed. The brother who had seemed cautious but rational during the planning phase had been replaced by someone whose grasp on reality was fragmenting. His medication, which he'd stopped taking after being released from the hospital, would have stabilized his paranoid symptoms. Without it, his disorder reasserted itself with increasing severity. He became convinced that Anna had always planned to betray him, that she'd set up the kidnapping as an elaborate trap to get him arrested while keeping all the money. The conditions of Anna's captivity worsened accordingly. Douglas reduced her food rations, claiming he needed to conserve supplies but really punishing her for what he perceived as her inevitable betrayal. He stopped cleaning the cabin or providing fresh water regularly. Anna lost weight rapidly, nearly 30 pounds between April and September, and developed infections from the unsanitary conditions. The chains rubbed her wrists and ankles raw, creating wounds that scarred. By late August, Anna was genuinely suffering from malnutrition and dehydration. She'd stopped arguing with Douglas, stopped pleading for release, and simply existed in a state of exhausted despair. The staged kidnapping had become real in every way that mattered. She was a prisoner, held against her will by someone whose mental illness had overridden any rational calculation of self-interest. In early September, something shifted in Douglas. Perhaps he recognized that Anna was dying and that would transform him from kidnapper to murderer. Perhaps his paranoia cycled into a brief period of clarity. Whatever the reason, he made the decision to end it. He couldn't release Anna in a way that made it look like escape. She was too weak to walk, and her condition would raise questions about why he'd kept her so long. Instead, he decided to stage her discovery in a way that maintained the fiction of the random stranger abduction. Douglas built a small fire outside the cabin on September 17th, knowing the smoke would eventually draw attention from rangers or hikers. He ensured Anna was still chained but loosened the lock mechanism so rescuers wouldn't need cutting tools. He reminded her of the story they'd agreed on: a man in camouflage, a vague description, a fictional victim who'd been taken with her. Then he drove away, planning to disappear into Nevada and never contact his sister again. Park rangers found Anna on September 18, 2002, exactly 6 months after she'd voluntarily climbed into Douglas's truck. The woman they discovered bore little resemblance to the confident hiker who'd set out that March morning. She was emaciated, traumatized, and barely conscious. Her rescue was treated as a miracle of survival, evidence of human resilience in the face of unimaginable cruelty. And in a terrible sense, it was. Anna had survived, though she'd become the victim of her own scheme. The plan that was supposed to be fake had been made real by Douglas's deteriorating mental state and paranoid delusions. The 2 weeks of manageable discomfort had stretched into 6 months of genuine imprisonment. The partner she trusted had become her captor, and the scam designed to extract money from her parents had extracted something far more valuable from Anna herself: her sense of safety, her trust in her own judgment, and any hope of escaping the consequences of what she'd set in motion. Chen closed the comprehensive report and added it to the file that would be presented to the grand jury. The story was complete now, every gap filled, every contradiction resolved. What remained was for the justice system to decide how to weigh Anna's genuine suffering against her undeniable culpability, and how to punish Douglas for transforming a conspiracy into a crime that had nearly killed his sister. Both had set a terrible plan in motion. Both would pay for it. But in the end, only one of them had been willing to let it destroy them both. The trial of Douglas and Anna Archer began in October 2006 in the Placer County Superior Court, 8 months after Douglas's arrest and 4 months after Anna's confession. The proceedings were consolidated into a single trial despite the siblings' differing levels of culpability, allowing the prosecution to present a unified narrative of conspiracy and betrayal. District Attorney Susan Portman led the prosecution personally, recognizing that the case had become one of the most closely watched in Northern California's recent history. The courtroom was packed every day with journalists, legal observers, and members of the public fascinated by the lurid details of a kidnapping plot that had been both staged and genuine. Douglas sat at the defense table wearing an orange jumpsuit, his expression vacant and detached, occasionally whispering to his court-appointed attorney but mostly staring at nothing. Anna sat separately with her own legal team, dressed in conservative business attire that made her look younger than her 27 years. She kept her eyes down throughout most of the proceedings, occasionally dabbing at tears but never looking toward her brother. Portman's opening statement laid out the prosecution's case with devastating clarity. She described 2 people consumed by resentment and desperation who had conspired to commit fraud against their own parents, setting in motion a chain of events that had nearly resulted in Anna's death. She made clear that while the siblings' culpability differed in degree, both were responsible for initiating a criminal enterprise that had deceived law enforcement, traumatized a family, and wasted tremendous public resources. The evidence was presented methodically over 3 weeks. Detective Riley Chin testified about the investigation, walking the jury through the discovery of the emails, the property records, and the cell tower data that placed Douglas at the cabin throughout Anna's captivity. Forensic technician Daniel Voss explained the fingerprint analysis, showing enlarged photographs of Anna's prints on the padlock mechanism and discussing what their placement revealed about her role in the setup. The prosecution introduced the receipts Anna had signed for chains, locks, and camping supplies, along with bank records showing her $3,000 cash withdrawal. They played recorded excerpts from both Douglas's and Anna's confessions, letting the siblings' own words establish their participation in planning the fake kidnapping. Financial experts testified about the ransom payment, tracing how the $200,000 had been delivered by the Archer parents and retrieved by Douglas. Perhaps most damaging were the emails themselves. Portman had them displayed on large screens in the courtroom, allowing jurors to read Anna's message about making it look real, and Douglas's reply about finding a location remote enough that nobody will stumble across it. The casual, conspiratorial tone of the correspondence made it impossible to view either sibling as an unwitting participant. Douglas's defense attorney, a public defender named William Matsuda, faced an impossible task. His client had confessed, the evidence was overwhelming, and Douglas's deteriorating mental state during testimony, he occasionally mumbled to himself or reacted to stimuli nobody else could perceive, made him appear dangerous rather than sympathetic. Matsuda focused on emphasizing Douglas's psychiatric diagnosis, arguing that paranoid personality disorder had compromised his ability to make rational decisions once the plan was in motion. Dr. Helen Cartwright, Douglas's former psychiatrist from Napa State Hospital, testified for the defense. She explained that patients with paranoid personality disorder often experienced escalating suspicion and irrational beliefs when under stress, and that Douglas's decision to stop taking medication after his release had removed the chemical buffer that kept his symptoms manageable. She acknowledged that Douglas had been capable of planning the initial conspiracy, but suggested that his continued imprisonment of Anna represented a break from rational thought rather than calculated cruelty. The prosecution countered with their own psychiatric expert, who testified that while Douglas's mental illness was real, it didn't eliminate his criminal responsibility. The premeditation evident in purchasing the cabin, installing restraints, and stockpiling supplies demonstrated clear intent and planning ability. The fact that his paranoia later intensified didn't excuse the 6 months he'd kept his sister chained in increasingly degrading conditions. Anna's defense was more nuanced. Her attorney, a private lawyer named Veronica Chin, whom Anna's parents had reluctantly agreed to fund, argued that while Anna had participated in planning a fraud, she'd become a genuine victim when Douglas betrayed their agreement. Veronica presented medical records documenting Anna's condition when rescued, the malnutrition, dehydration, infections, and psychological trauma. She brought in Anna's therapist, who testified about the PTSD symptoms Anna still experienced 4 years later. The defense called Anna to testify in her own defense, a risky strategy but one they deemed necessary. Anna spent 2 days on the stand, tearfully recounting her financial desperation, her resentment toward her parents, and her terrible decision to involve Douglas in a scheme she believed would be temporary and victimless. She described the horror of realizing Douglas wasn't going to release her, of watching him deteriorate mentally while she remained chained and helpless. Under Portman's cross-examination, Anna admitted she'd known about Douglas's psychiatric history and his history of violence toward their father. She acknowledged purchasing the supplies that made her own imprisonment possible and writing the ransom note that extorted $200,000 from her parents. When Portman asked if she'd considered the possibility that involving a mentally unstable person in a high-stress criminal conspiracy might result in exactly the kind of escalation that occurred, Anna could only whisper, "I thought I could control it. I was wrong." The testimony of Robert and Margaret Archer was perhaps the most emotionally devastating moment of the trial. The elderly couple took the stand together, holding hands as they described the nightmare of their daughter's disappearance and the agony of waiting for news during the 6 months she was missing. Robert's voice broke as he recounted delivering the ransom money, believing he was saving his daughter's life, only to learn years later that both his children had been conspiring against him. "We lost both our children that day in March," Margaret said quietly. "One to imprisonment and one to his own darkness. But we lost them long before that, really. We failed them in ways we're only now beginning to understand. That doesn't excuse what they did, but we bear some responsibility for the resentments that drove them to it." The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, they found Douglas Archer guilty on all counts: kidnapping, false imprisonment, extortion, fraud, and filing false reports. They found Anna Archer guilty of conspiracy to commit fraud, filing false police reports, and obstruction of justice, but acquitted her of kidnapping charges given that she'd also been a victim of the crime. The sentencing hearing took place 3 weeks later. Judge Christopher Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the bench known for his measured temperament, spent considerable time reviewing psychiatric evaluations and victim impact statements before pronouncing sentence. For Douglas, the judge acknowledged the role mental illness had played in the crime's escalation but emphasized that psychiatric diagnosis didn't eliminate culpability. "You planned this crime methodically over months," Morrison said, looking directly at Douglas. "You purchased property specifically for imprisoning your sister. You installed restraints. You stockpiled supplies. These actions demonstrate clear intent and planning ability. When your sister's life hung in the balance, you chose to keep her imprisoned rather than seek help or release her. That choice, made repeatedly over 6 months, reflects a level of cruelty that cannot be excused by mental illness alone." Douglas Archer was sentenced to 35 years in state prison without possibility of parole for 25 years. He would be 64 years old before he could even apply for release, and given the severity of his crimes, parole seemed unlikely. As the sentence was read, Douglas showed no reaction, staring ahead with the same vacant expression he'd maintained throughout the trial. Anna's sentencing was more complex. Judge Morrison acknowledged that she'd become a genuine victim of the conspiracy she'd helped create, suffering real physical and psychological harm. But he noted that none of that suffering would have occurred if she hadn't initiated the scheme in the first place. "You made a series of catastrophic decisions driven by financial desperation and resentment," Morrison told Anna. "You chose to commit fraud against your parents. You chose to involve a mentally unstable brother you knew had a history of violence. You chose to stage an elaborate deception that consumed law enforcement resources and traumatized your family. The fact that your plan went horribly wrong doesn't absolve you of responsibility for setting it in motion." Anna Archer was sentenced to 8 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 5 years. The sentence was substantial but far less than what Douglas received, reflecting the court's recognition that Anna had genuinely suffered as a victim even while bearing responsibility as a perpetrator. As Anna was led from the courtroom, she finally looked at her parents for the first time since the trial began. Robert and Margaret sat in the front row, both openly weeping. Anna mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," but whether they saw or acknowledged it was unclear. The bailiff guided her through the side door, and she disappeared into the hallway leading to the holding cells. Outside the courthouse, Robert and Margaret Archer released a brief statement through their attorney, Lawrence Kepler. They expressed their profound grief over their children's betrayal and acknowledged their own failures as parents. They announced they would be establishing a foundation to support mental health services for families dealing with psychiatric disorders, hoping that some good might come from their tragedy. They asked for privacy as they tried to rebuild their shattered lives. The media coverage of the trial was extensive and divided. Some commentators focused on Anna's victimization, arguing that she'd been punished enough by her 6 months of captivity and that her prison sentence was excessive. Others emphasized her culpability, noting that she'd knowingly involved a mentally unstable person in a dangerous criminal scheme and had to accept responsibility for the foreseeable consequences. For Detective Riley Chin, watching the sentencing from the back of the courtroom, the conclusion felt less like justice achieved and more like damage contained. 2 people were going to prison, but no amount of incarceration would undo the harm they'd inflicted on themselves and their family. The case had consumed a year of her professional life, and while she'd successfully solved what had once seemed like an unsolvable mystery, the victory felt hollow. The California woods mystery was finally solved, but the solution satisfied no one. There was no monster lurking in the forest, no random predator terrorizing hikers. Instead, there was a family destroyed by resentment, mental illness, and catastrophically poor judgment. Anna Archer had sought to escape her financial problems by staging her own kidnapping, never imagining that her unstable brother would transform the staged captivity into a genuine nightmare that would haunt her for years. The case became a cautionary tale studied in criminology courses and discussed in psychology seminars, an example of how desperation and mental illness could combine to create tragedies that hurt everyone involved. It demonstrated the dangerous unpredictability of involving unstable people in criminal schemes and the way conspiracies could spiral beyond their architect's control. As the courthouse emptied and the journalists dispersed to file their stories, the fundamental truth remained unchanged. A young woman had vanished into the California woods in March 2002, and when she was found 6 months later, chained to a bed in a remote cabin, she'd been both perpetrator and victim of her own terrible plan. Justice had been served in the legal sense, but for the Archer family, there would be no real justice, only the long, painful process of trying to understand how love, resentment, and desperation had combined to destroy them all.